Hello, my name is Leonard Kleinrock. I'm chairman of the Computer Science Department at UCLA. We have here a really exciting and dynamic environment. And one of the activities that contributes to that environment and that excitement is the constant flow of visitors who come and spend time with us and interact with our faculty and student body. Each year, we select a few from among the very best researchers in the field and ask them to participate in our distinguished lecture series. The high point of their visit is the presentation of a lecture to our faculty and student body. And at that lecture, they present the state of the art in their field of specialty. They describe the research results, the open problems, and the directions in which the field is likely to go. And as you might expect, these lectures always generate a great deal of enthusiasm and interaction. I'm really pleased you have chosen to join us today. Let's go inside. The lecture's about to begin.
Good afternoon. The cookies are gone, so we may as well begin. The wall and the hill outside Belter Hall has collapsed. A tree fell down on Westwood Boulevard today and nearly killed a passerby. She didn't realize it. We're doing fine. So in light of that, let me welcome you to the first of our distinguished lectures this year. I don't have to tell you that there are some major events that have been occurring over the last year or two. The internet is exploding. All the administrations have been talking about the information infrastructure. The commercial world has found that the internet is a viable entity for their activities. Companies are being sued for misuse of information. Scientologists are literally removing messages running around the internet that criticize them, anti-messages. Just last week, CompuServe said you can't send any GIF images around without getting a license from them. So I say all that to sensitize you that there's more than just details of computer science that you have to worry about in dealing with today's problems of computer science. There are social issues, legal issues, policy issues. And so we're beginning this year with a presentation regarding those kinds of issues. And we have an expert with us, Anne Branscomb, and I'd like to tell you something about her background that she brings to this discussion. In her own words, Anne grew up in genteel poverty in southern Georgia. Her father was president of the Georgia State College for Women, and major influence in her youth was World War II. As a child, she sat in the courts when she was in school, and she became fascinated with law. But she also realized that raising children who get mumps, chickenpox, and measles would get in the way of doing trial law. Just imagine the Simpson trial today. Excuse me, Your Honor, I have to pick up my child. She was always interested in communications generally, but not necessarily in the science side, but rather on the drama side, because she felt that there was a relationship between computers, law, and drama. But in fact, the computer side of her personality didn't emerge early on at all. It came quite a bit later. She has joint degrees in drama and political science, which in fact serve her well in these kinds of deliberations. As an example, her first two jobs were at opposite ends of the communications spectrum, if you will. One was with the Library of Congress. Second was as an intelligence officer with the CIA. When she began working for them, she pledged not to tell what she did, and I couldn't get it out of her today. But she did say she was working on NSA intercepts in a counterintelligence group. This was in the early 1950s. She would sit and interpret messages and try to put together what the Soviets were saying. And this was a clear application of what she had studied in school, namely a combination of political science and comparative governments. Let's think that one through. Moreover, it was the only place hiring at the time. And in fact, she thought she'd been hired by the Democratic National Committee. Due to some mix-up, she ended up with the CIA. At the time she took a position with the CIA, she had just finished graduate school on a Rotary Foundation fellowship with the London School of Economics. She had been at Harvard for a year. She came back to the States, got married, and then went into law school at George Washington University to keep from getting bored at home with children. But she went at a slow pace. She took only 2 courses at a time. She spent a year in Europe, took a total of 7 years, and graduated at the top of her class. There were only 2 women in the program when she began, and only 12 when she left. When the dean asked her what she wanted to do, she wanted to go home and read Good Housekeeping. And she was serious. But the dean pointed her to a law firm. And since she really didn't want the job, she could be cavalier and bold in the interview. In fact, she was the first woman hired in that law firm. There was no prejudice with her or against her in the law firm, in school. But she did ask them why they wanted to hire a woman. And the answer was all the men wanted to do trial law, and they needed somebody to go to the library and do research. Well, she agreed she would do it if she could get off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, go home and take care of the kids. And they said, fine. But in fact, she didn't stay in the library very long because one of the first cases she was put on was a case regarding export control. It seems a German company was losing the import-export privileges because they had built a petrochemical plant in Romania. And the government had a problem with that. Anne was the only one who knew about Export Control Act, and so she took on the case. She then bounced around a bit. She went to Colorado and clerked for a federal judge there. The issue was noise pollution at Stapleton Airport. Now they have baggage pollution, if you will. She wrote the dissent regarding the legal reapportionment of the legislature. It went to the Supreme Court, and that's where she really learned a great deal about law. But she got bored with law in Boulder, Colorado. She found it unchallenging. So she got involved in democratic politics in Colorado. And that's when she discovered computers, that late in her career. What she did is she collected some databases from 10 most populous states regarding their political activities and found these databases would not interoperate. Big surprise, right? That gave her a very fresh start and a shocking start in the field of computers. She then visited her friend in New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is where, of course, election fever just reigns. And her friend happened to be her friend's husband happened to be chairman of the Republican Party. She found out that the Republicans, no surprise, were ahead of the Democrats in their use of computers. She tried hard to help the Democrats, but went back to Washington as attorney and started doing communications law seriously. She found, in fact, that was appropriate. In Washington, she got heavily involved with communications law. She represented radio and TV licensees. She was assigned to sit through the cable hearing for Baseball Commission in 1972 in New York, became interested in cable problems, and was hired by a teleprompter company as an in-house attorney. She handled FCC problems and state problems, and then she grew to dislike New York, living in New York. She started working for a consulting group in Cambridge, Massachusetts, attended some lectures by De Sola Poole on education and telecommunications policy, and by Tony Ottinger on information policy, and he got her into information policy problems where we find her today. She did an article on cable policy to justify the deregulation of cable and the corporation, and she thus became an expert on telecommunications policy. Early in the 80s, she became an active member of the American Bar Association because they began then in the 80s to look at basically global networks. They didn't know much about communication networks. So she thought she could gather at most a dozen people to collaborate on this study. They got 112 people on the project who educated themselves on value-added services and produced a book entitled Toward a Law of Global Communications Networks. Anne was one of the first policy analysts to use the term information infrastructure. She wrote a paper for the Aspen Institute in 1975 entitled After Deregulation, Designing the Information Infrastructure. That, of course, is a term which has become popular these 20 years later. And they considered some questions we still consider very important today, like how much functionality and how many different kinds of consoles should there be on the box that sits on top of your TV? What should flow through that box? Should it be an end device? Should it pass things through to the computers in your home as well? She was probably one of the first people, moreover, to look at what she calls rogue programs, viruses, worms, etc. The Computer Law Institute got her involved in these things due to the worm produced by one of your colleagues, graduate student named Robert Morris. As a result, she did a paper on rogue computer programs. There's now some law with some teeth in it. Turns out what Morris got when he was convicted was I think 300 hours of community service, $10,000. But she pointed out today that it was a felony conviction. He lost his right to vote, and he could not run for public office. So there actually was some teeth in that conviction, which I originally thought was much too mild. $10,000 for millions of dollars of devastated computers. She's the author of a book with the following tantalizing title, Who Owns Information? That book was published last year. She's held academic positions as adjunct professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, as professor of telecommunications law and public policy at the Polytechnic University, served as trustee on the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, National Public Radio, EDUCOM, trustee for Pacific Telecommunications Council, member of the steering committee of the National Academy of Science Project on Rights and Responsibilities of Users of Computerized Information Networks, and on and on and on. This year, she's in residence at the University of Pennsylvania as a senior scholar in the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Since 1987, she's been a research associate at the Harvard University Law School and the program on Information Resources Policy. Today, you're going to have a whirlwind tour entitled Roadblocks on the Global Infobahn. Ann?
Video.
And then when you come to the Big Bend, what do? You cross over the street and then make a right turn. The internet is extremely important. It embodies, its architecture is highly decentralized. In fact, it's the world's largest functioning anarchy. It encourages new uses. It demands that users control the network, not some central authority.
Hi, excuse me, what's the information superhighway?
Data.
Data.
I got
What's the information superhighway?
That's some data. You're asking the wrong people.
Why are you asking me?
We only design it.
Let me tell you something about it. You have access, how do you know what?
Hey, Greg.
On the information superhighway, there are no hitchhikers. There are no speed limits. There are no missed stops. There are no treats. But there will be a passing lane. A passing lane.
Because the whole future of the system is being driven by the marketplace, there's a real potential here for a system that is unaffordable to a lot of people. We may see a system where many people will not be able to pay for what they basically need in order to function in the society. And in essence, if they can't participate in the electronic system, in the telecommunication system, they cannot participate in society.
Have you ever watched the movie you wanted to? The minute you wanted to? Learn special things. All taken from jazz. No questions from faraway places. So where did jazz come from? Good question. What tucked your baby? From a phone booth. You will.
Ted Turner, in one of his unguarded moments, said any people watching network television will be the poor, the elderly, and the minorities. Well, there is a broadcasting vision for you, or a vision of television that is somewhat nightmarish. So that you pay more and more, yes, and there's pay-per-view, or watch your son and daughter at home sprinkling through, running their fingers like through the yellow pages of television looking for a movie, and $3.95 a shot, and they don't like it, $3.95 another one. Before you know it, your television is a $200 utility.
I want to show you something. This is an electronic classroom. When we link to the Education Center in Washington, D.C., we have in this school the very best teachers. And although they are computer generated, they can interact with each student individually at his or her level, providing that special help exactly when and where it's needed. Not all the children in this neighborhood get that kind of attention at home.
Also, put us online at Colton's Bridal Service.
Lily, please authorize your electronic mannequin.
Open clothing file, transmit mannequin, Lily, white tunic and heels.
Now here's the basic dress.
Kind of someone would look like it was just a little shorter.
Shorter.
You're firm, Mom.
How's this?
I think maybe it's just a little too showy. Definitely. There is one type of dress that I'd really like to see. It's a retro look. Something that they might have worn in the 1920s.
Okay, let me suggest this one.
Can I see a cloche hat with that and a veil? And show me a bouquet just for the heck of it.
Message for
That's really up and down there.
Wilson.
Make sure Papa finishes his report today. Make you guys some sandwiches. They're in the refrigerator when you get hungry. I'll go around. Bye.
Well, the hype about the global Infobahn really started many years ago in science fiction, where the writers were always seem able to see the future better than the futurists. Arthur Clarke, who was both a scientist and a science fiction writer, long ago predicted that we would have what he called a console, a communications box that would be a combination of radio, television, telephone, mailbox, computer, and stereo player, all receiving their various messages from satellites circling the globe. Last fall, the Washington Post carried an article that said Arthur Clarke's console had become a reality, but the new hardware is called the digital chameleon. Today, the media predict that this digital chameleon will bring us 500 or more television channels on demand, a Nickelodeon in the sky, a cornucopia of knowledge, indeed a seamless web of more than 5 billion inhabitants, and an online, real-life, simultaneously translated IRC chat. It boggles the mind. That's the hype. What some of us think we now have is in reality too many distractions advising us to watch, play, bet, and buy. I think the title, if you can't read this, looks like a little traffic jam on the information superhighway. You know, whether we will achieve this utopian dream or fall back into dystopian depth really remains to be seen. And what we're going to explore today is some of the roadblocks that stand in the way of gaining universal access to this global Infobahn through our digital chameleons. Since we can't cover all the potential hazards that may inhibit our access, I'd like to discuss some that I consider particularly troublesome. These are confusion about what we're dealing with, the problems of communicating through unfriendly and incompatible user interfaces, questions about the liability of both providers and users of information services, and what we can do or should do about governance of what we call cyberspace, the electronic space through which we are all communicating or sharing information via computer-mediated communications. Now, the first view is one of an information superhighway, or collections of superhighways that transport digital messages of zeros and ones, merging all types of personal as well as mass media, including all that Arthur Clarke's console would make available. It's a high-speed transmission system making irrelevant time, space, and nationality. This view of the superhighway is primarily a technical one, driven by what the technology can do for us and not what we'd like to do with it. Now, the second view is that of a marketplace, where we will be able to find a plethora of information products. It will be the First Amendment dream realized, a marketplace of ideas where everyone can be a publisher, everyone a consumer. It is, in fact, a transformation to an information economy. And this is, of course, an economist's view of exchanging values for benefits. The third view is a social one. one of electronic cafes where people gather to talk and share their experiences, where art and music thrive, where there is a free-flowing conversation, laughter, and where you can meet people from all over the world that you might not encounter anywhere else. It has been described as a place without social, racial, linguistic, or physical prejudice. A place where you judge by what you say and not by what you look like or where you come from. A true meeting of the minds. The fourth view is a political one of the Greek agora, the dream of an electronic democracy, a public place where everyone can enter, where everyone can speak, where all can hear and be heard, where all can vote. What computer-mediated communication systems permit that no other communications medium has in the past is to bring together in interactive exchange many-to-many voices. The fifth view is that of cyberspace, a frontier, an uncharted wilderness where console cowboys ride into the virtual reality sunset. It's a dangerous place, highly individualistic, very innovative, but lawless. The pioneers, many of them, like it that way. They prefer to live in a chaotic but provocative environment, as Mitch Kapoor has just described, the world's largest electronic anarchy, one that is fearlessly guarded by its inhabitants. These, the original hackers who designed the system as a caring and sharing communal environment, really don't want outsiders coming in and telling them what to do. If there be any rules, they want to make them themselves. Well, the fact is that the global Infobahn is really all of these things, and perhaps many more that we really cannot yet perceive. It provides an infrastructure for social, political, economic, and artistic endeavors of all kinds. Nonetheless, how we determine the rules of the road will decide who can or cannot use it, how easily they will be able to navigate the routes, and what benefits can be derived from it. There are a number of problems that will affect the utility of the global Infobahn for economic activities. Our primary concern is the incompatible user interfaces that make it difficult to change from one piece of software to another without encountering severe difficulties. Another is the lack of protection for collections of factual material within the copyright regime, the removal of the requirement for a copyright notice upon entry into the Berne Convention, and the problems of free riders, pirates if you like, who take and copy whatever they like rather than paying for it. And in addition, the paucity of economists who have to date taken an interest in even pursuing the subject of the economics of information. Now, my main complaint is the incompatibility of interfaces. This one, if you can't rate it, is no, it's 3 thumps for call waiting and 5 thumps for call forwarding. There's nothing really that bugs me more than trying desperately to remember how to look up in voluminous and non-helpful documentation how to sign off on the system when it is continuing to charge me dollars per minute for access. I don't know whether it's sign off, log off, quit, stop, exit, disconnect, escape, or help. Icons also are for me, a legal word person, even worse. I cannot distinguish them on the laptop, and they're not very intuitive to me, even when I see them. And nothing could be worse than having an icon for can be storage in one program and trash in another. One astute commentator has observed that anyone using half a dozen software packages could wind up mastering 150 or so icons, the hieroglyphics of the 1990s. I'd be as literate, he said, as an Egyptian 7-year-old from the time of the pharaohs. Now, the reason for this diversity of interfaces is not that some software designers thought it was a better way of getting you into their software. The diversity is pushed by the copyright laws that dictate that each piece of software, in order to obtain copyright protection, must be original expression. What the users want, however, is for the interfaces to become more and more similar and certainly more friendly. We don't want to deal with keyboards with 600 hieroglyphic icons, and we want to be computer-literate cybernauts and not electronic Egyptians. The legal protection for computer software, in my view, needs to encourage software developers to write to compatible interfaces and useful industry-standardized platforms, but with the assurance that they will receive fair value for their innovations on the information marketplace. And I think clearly the confused system we have today of overlapping jurisdictions of copyright, patents, and trade secret laws for the protection of computer software need to be rethought and rewritten to accommodate a network world where components need to fit comfortably together, and we need reliable software components that can be put together, and we need to encourage people to do so. Now, second, we need a methodology for protecting facts compiled in databases. Justice O'Connor, in writing the Feist decision, clearly stated that facts are not appropriable and must remain in the public domain. However we determine what is factual, those facts are not protectable under the copyright law. This is a correct interpretation of the copyright law, and I don't argue with the decision on that basis. What I do contest is the ability to foreclose proprietary protection of all facts contained in databases. Although arguably it is the search algorithm that is valuable, and the proprietor of the database should be able to protect its methodology for searching, there is also a considerable amount of labor involved in the collection and organization of that data, and these are valuable assets that a competitor should not be able to walk away with and incorporate into a new product without an exchange of something of value. Now, third, I think we need electronic markers to tell what kind of electronic environment we're entering. This, I guess, we can't read either. This is the little girl that the show and tell saying how I spent the summer vacation and she's giving all the rights reserved and giving all the notices of what's proprietary in her presentation. Prior to the entry of the United States into the Berne Convention, you may remember that we were required to put a little C and a circle to indicate that that was copyrighted material when it was published. But the Berne Convention requires no such notice, and U.S. law was changed to omit that requirement in order for us to become a member of Berne. As a consequence, when you enter an electronic space, you don't know whether it's public or private, and whether the material is proprietary or public domain and therefore free for the taking. I think in cyberspace, or at least on the internet, there has grown a perception that anything you enter into a Usenet conference is public domain. And here anybody can, and usually does, quote postings and retransmits them to others, or even incorporates them into proprietary documents for use elsewhere. Now, however, with commercial interests, which are now 70% of the domains fast invading the internet, I think this presumption has met with considerable difficulty. And so I think it's time for us to set forth again a necessity for electronic markers which can define proprietary postings from public postings, and I think it's just as important to post what is public domain so that people can be clearly aware that this is something they can take and transmit to others. Otherwise, I don't think our concept of an electronic agora will work at all. Now, there are serious problems arising. I think that one's backwards. No, oh yeah, it says try not to enter the wrong password. There's the question of looking at liability and tort liabilities and what the reasonable computer user would do under the circumstances. But what kind of electronic environment should the responsible information entrepreneur provide? The cases are rapidly entering the courts that aren't going to give us much time or breathing room before having to decide some of the most difficult questions. In the past, we have developed clear dividing lines between certain kinds of information providers and information transport systems. As you can see, in fact, there are lawyers that are newspaper lawyers and cable lawyers and broadcasting lawyers and so forth, so that there is really a different whole discipline of the law related to different types of information transport systems. The publishers are responsible for editing their content, and they are liable to those who might be defamed by their publications. Carriers were not meant to be censors, but were required to serve all those who needed to send messages. And they're not held to be liable to their customers except for timely and accurate delivery of the messages. Now, newsstands and bookstores, on the other hand, were held to be distributors for whom it would be in a position to have to pre-read and stand by their offerings on the marketplace. Although this presumption does not prevail in the United Kingdom, and the distributors are held responsible for defamation. Broadcasters were licensed to use a public asset, the airwaves, and therefore they were held responsible as trustees to manage that public asset in the public interest. Cable television systems, on the other hand, are a legal hybrid that are held to be like publishers on some channels over which they do exert control, and foreclosed from censoring programs offered on public access channels, and required, on the other hand, to provide least access channels to customers who want to originate their own programs. So we really have a very complex legal system with respect to existing media. It's not so clear what the rules should be for a telephone company now that wishes to provide television programs, or a cable television system that wants to provide telephone service. And suppose a newspaper wanted to provide all three. Can you separate the conduit when the owner is one and the same? The conduit from the content. And should it be separated? Actually, if you look back on the history of newspapers really edit, print, and deliver on products. So in that particular environment, it is all clustered. Now, accountability of users and liability of information providers are probably, I think, the two most important issues to be resolved if computer-mediated communication is to become the accepted and most prevalent form of communication on the electronic superhighways. It may be that we are placing too much reliance upon computers. This is no one here knows how many tens to give you for 100, sir. The computer is down. May also be that we are blaming the computer for too much. This is really the stock market falling and the bull saying the computer made me do it. I thought it was the bear that came down. Maybe it's the bear at the bottom saying the computer made me do it. We simply don't know with any certainty what the reasonable computer user would do under the circumstances, and that's the standard by which we measure a right to litigate for negligent behavior under the rubric of tort law. Already today, there are unresolved conflicts about accountability and liability, which are moving rapidly into the courts with some very troubling results. Now, one legal scholar has proposed that there should be strict liability to be applied to all information providers, including both large commercial enterprises and the smaller operators of bulletin boards, or the SysOps. I think if strict liability becomes the norm, then much of the free-flowing commentary on the internet, as well as on the bulletin boards, will either come to a halt or diminish to the floor of an arroyo in summer. The SysOps are already not just chilled, but appalled by some of the recent decisions which have been rendered in the courts. Strict liability for users of information transport systems, on the other hand, will also run smack into a brick wall of users who are accustomed to using pseudonyms or aliases and consider it their electronically given right to remain anonymous. Indeed, the proliferation of anonymous commercial remailers residing outside the United States suggests that any effort to rid the system of anonymity would meet with strong resistance. Now, the areas in which accountability and liability are most relevant, I think, are copyright infringements, electronic defamation, obscene or pornographic graphics, sexual harassment, and cyber crimes. One of the recent relevant cases in the copyright law, copyright area, involved 170 GIF files on a bulletin board of photographs that were taken from Playboy magazine. Now, many of the SysOps do offer users an opportunity to upload information and make no effort to monitor the content. And this was the case with the Tax Warehouse VBS, which was operated by George Freena. And he claimed to have no knowledge of the GIF files that were on his bulletin board. But the court held nonetheless that knowledge of the existence of the copyrighted material was not a good defense. And the fact that they existed on his bulletin board was quite enough to hold him responsible. I think that's very troubling when you consider how many bulletin board operators are permitting free uploading and downloading. The bulletin board was a subscription board with users paying for access, and the court held that the use was clearly commercial, that the BBS operator was guilty of copyright infringement, as well as trademark infringement by placing his own advertisement on some of the photographs. Now, there's a more recent case which was just dismissed at the end of the year. against an MIT student, David Lamacchia, who had provided space on the MIT computers for his colleagues to upload and download software. Now, he allegedly did not upload any software himself, and I'm not quite sure why MIT turned him over to the feds, to tell the truth. I think it would have been quite sufficient for them to just stop the bulletin board and chastise him or withdraw his privileges for a few months in using the system. But they did turn him over to the feds, and what the feds did was a little peculiar. They filed suit against him, saying that $1 million worth of copyrighted software had been transmitted and uploaded and downloaded on the system. They charged him with wire fraud. Actually, there was no fraud. I mean, all the people who uploaded and downloaded the copyrighted software knew exactly what they were doing. Nobody was misled. So it was a poor allegation, I think, to start with. But the judge made an interesting comment. He said that he declined to pour new wine into old bottles. He said that he really admonished Congress to make the decision of what behavior should be made criminal, because he was afraid that it would subject millions of PC users to potential criminal charges using a very old law designed for a different purpose. Now, the next area I'd like to talk about is electronic defamation. And I think it's hard for many of us lawyers to see why the current law of defamation doesn't work perfectly well in an electronic environment, as well as it does for a printed publication. But the real issue, I think, is not whether the defamation has occurred, but whether the information provider has a responsibility to monitor all messages in order to assure that no defamation takes place. And the only case we have that has come down, which a lot of the providers really like, is one which held CompuServe to be a distributor of news and not a publisher. And they said that because he was serving as a distributor of many types of electronic information, that he couldn't be held responsible to have to monitor all of them. However, I think this is still one should not rely upon to avoid liability, since in that case there was a subcontractor who was responsible for the environment on which the defamation took place. So there was someone that could be held accountable. But I think as far as many of the small bulletin board operators, it would be very difficult to require them to monitor everything. So I think it's a very troubling area. To hold them strictly liable for every potential defamation would really render them into cyber cops, or a role that none of them really want to take. And the easiest, most viable solution is to adopt a legal mechanism that has been rejected for the newspapers in a Supreme Court case a couple of decades ago, and applied to the broadcasting industry with the fairness doctrine, which was really also abandoned fairly recently, but it's to revive the right of reply. And the general counsels of both Prodigy and America Online have publicly suggested this is the only viable solution they see to offering a reasonable opportunity to reply in the channel on which the defamation took place. And the next area I'd like, well, this is one that goes with unintentional tort. What do we get next? Oh, this is the one on pornographic images. This is one of the little girls said, Dad has been telling me about some totally weird machine called the Facts of Life. And the case I'd like to discuss with you briefly in this area is called the Amateur Action case. It's one that took place, the actual prosecution was in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis was selected because it's in the Bible Belt, and therefore one in which the local community standards are very strict in terms of what is considered to be obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. The attorneys who handled this case said that the trial would never have been initiated in California because such photographs are in fact readily available in the Bay Area for anyone to buy. Now, the Amateur Action Bulletin Board was a subscription bulletin board, and the users were consenting adults within an electronically mediated environment. In fact, the person who downloaded the material was recruited for that purpose and was a postal inspector. So there is some question of entrapment, although the court did not find that to be the case. But no one really entered this space without their knowledge and consent. And I think the case raises some very important issues of which community standards should apply, that of the uploading provider or that of the downloading user, or of the community standards maintained by and within the virtual community. And it will give eventually, will probably end up in the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it's not the cleanest case to take up to the Supreme Court because there were some materials that were actually transmitted through the mails, and I think that's unfortunate to clutter up the facts. But if this case doesn't go up, another one will have to, because, or otherwise, then Congress is going to have to address the issue of how you decide whether you apply the standards of the virtual community or the local community. I think if there is a real impact on the local community, such as the case of using children for pornographic images, then clearly the local jurisdiction's rules would apply, and I don't think you can use the shield of the community standards of the virtual community. But it would appear suitable to devise appropriate electronic markers to identify images and text that might prove objectionable to large numbers of users, so that it would permit domains or individuals to avoid being exposed to GIF files or textual material that they find offensive. And I think this would offer the greatest freedom of choice without transgressing the spirit of the First Amendment, which is alive and well in cyberspaces, even though in such global electronic environments, you have to remember that the First Amendment is only a local ordinance with no real legal teeth in it beyond the confines of the U.S. and its territorial waters. And the next case I'd like to discuss is one arising here in California, with which you're probably familiar. This is the Super Oak Leaf Online at Santa Rosa Junior College, which was allegedly a private bulletin board on which I think there were only 12 males that were using this bulletin board, but some of them spoke rather unfortunately about a couple of females, and one of the men broke the confidentiality pledge and told the two young women what had transpired on the bulletin board, and they took their complaints to the college and to the Office of Education, which applies Title IX, which prohibits sexual harassment, and the school was ordered to close down this bulletin board because it was allegedly creating harassment for these women. Well, I find this from a legal standpoint a little peculiar in the sense that they were not on this bulletin board. It's also true that universities do provide dorm rooms and locker rooms in which private conversations among men or women do take place, and I think this is raising the question of whether or not you can really have a private electronic space on which you can have such a discussion. It was in fact the women who requested a female-only bulletin board, and at a recent conference I went to, a Native American raised the question of whether or not they could really have a all Native American electronic conference. So I think we have to rethink whether or not we don't want to prescribe that certain spaces can be private, regardless of whether we agree or not agree with what is said on them. Now, the next area that I'd like to talk about a little bit is cybercrimes and rogue behavior. This is just the two robots saying it's just a little computer virus. Cybercrime is not real crime. Real crimes occur outside of cyberspace, and real crimes in which a computer is an instrument of a criminal act usually fall within the jurisdiction of real criminal statutes. We've made a lot of progress in the last few years refining the law with respect to abusive behavior that endangers the health of the computerized environment itself. And the felony conviction of Robert Morris, which Professor Kleinrock referred to, for entering the worm into the internet and bringing down the system, really was the first foray into stricter rules for hackers and crackers. But this summer, the Omnibus Crime Bill did contain an amendment to the Computer Abuse Act that would make clear that reckless disregard could be considered sufficient intent. This is the questionable thing that lots of lawyers felt was not clear in the law, that the court did interpret merely putting the virus into the system as criminal intent, which a lot of us thought was a bit improper, but it's quite clear now that that's the case. It was also clarified to make clear that all interstate commerce was affected would be a federal offense. Now, some civil rights activists think this new law goes too far in endangering the professional futures of the roads that really intend only to show their prowess and hope not to do any harm and do it unintentionally. But I think the lines are clearly being drawn tighter over what is considered unacceptable and abusive behavior. But we still don't want to put our best and most promising budding young computer programmers into jail for their teenage follies. So what sanctions are appropriate to apply, I think, remains a very troubling and unsettled question. There remains a doubt that when something that started as a prank becomes a real crime, and whether or not many of us may be guilty of negligent or even criminal behavior, because we've not yet become computer literate enough to navigate through all these unfriendly user interfaces. I assume you can all read this. Yeah. Robert Nunn, who I think is the head of the computer sciences department at Yale, has written in a recent article and suggested that crime laws have not really curbed attempts to gain unauthorized access. And extrapolating from attempts reported in his department, he estimates 26 million attempts, or an average of 72,000 a day. But he suggested that rather than criminal sanctions, because there have only been 3 cases filed under the federal law, that these are seldom effective. And he suggests that providers should agree to a protocol that prescribes unauthorized entry and excludes those users who do not conform to expectations of reasonable levels of behavior, exclude them from using the computer facilities. And that's really a very severe penalty for Siberians, but we'll put them on notice that this behavior is no longer acceptable. It's just a game. And the next thing I'd like to talk about, Elizabeth, this you may, if you can read it, is just a question of people raising the question about whether they've accidentally broken into a system and not realizing what they've done. The next area that I'd like to talk about is what are acceptable uses and what is social netiquette or what is socially acceptable. The case that I'd like to talk about is the one of the lawyers in Phoenix, Arizona, Campbell and Spiegel, who spammed the internet. I assume all of you know what spamming is. What do you? You hate them. Well, this is an example of how the users of the internet have expressed their distaste about behavior, and this was. It really created a spate of resentment among pioneer users of the internet, which many of you are. And what Kennard and Cedar did was enter postings, as you know, on their green card lottery on hundreds of Usenet conferences. You know, since some users subscribed to several of these conferences, many were deluged with what one of them called, it was like opening a mailbox and finding thousands of junk mail letters with postage due. And so many users were outraged that they sent irate email messages. I guess many of you sent some of these messages. But some of them also sent letter bombs, which I think is going a little bit beyond acceptable retaliation. You know, eventually the couple were ordered off the network by their network providers, whom they now intend to sue. I'm not sure that they can find someone to take the case because I did talk to some good friends in Phoenix who had refused to represent them. But I think the couple have found happiness in the information marketplace anyway, since they are reputed to have given up their legal practice, which precipitated $100,000 in new legal clients for a consulting business in what you might guess is advising people on how to advertise on the internet. Now, I'm inclined to recommend that such spamming of listserv conferences and the email boxes should be prohibited. I think it's outrageous to think that there's a right to insist that someone pay to have their email boxes stuffed with information they do not want. It's somewhat different from the junk mail that you get in your mailbox, although I happen to not like that very much either. But I at least don't have to pay for it to be sent to me. And I think so long as the advertisers have available to them the World Wide Web and an opportunity to put home pages on the system, that I don't think they should be able to successfully argue that their First Amendment rights are being infringed. I do think it would run less risk of rejection were the prohibition to be imposed as a general rule by the networks themselves rather than seeking legislation to prohibit the advertising. Now, there's another interesting case. I don't know how many of you know about Mr. Bumble on the Lambda Move. Is this a case you're very familiar with? Well, this is an interesting one again, of a situation in which the users of the electronic space took the law into their own hands. In other words, I'm not sure exactly what Mr. Bumble did. I think he took over the ability to express what the woman he was committing rape on was saying, so that he was manipulating her as well as his own himself. But anyway, everybody agreed that this was a terrible thing to have done. They didn't want it on the Lambda Move, which really is a professional group that are interested in virtual reality or multimedia. I'm not sure which, but they're all professionals using the system to discuss their work. And they became very concerned about Mr. Bumble and his virtual rape. And they had long discussions over what to do about him and how to get rid of him, or was it fair to get rid of him, and how did they go about deciding it, and what constituted due process, and so forth. Well, finally, after much lengthy discussion, the wizards decided that there was a consensus that they should get rid of Mr. Bumble, so he was toted. Is that a term you understand? I mean, in fairy tale terms, he was turned into a frog. We would call this shunning by the Amish, or banished to Siberia if you were the former Soviet Union. And in this case, he was banished from the Lambda Move and prohibited from participating in that conference. In fact, what he did was go out and got a different internet address and come back, and several months later, the other participants of the Lambda Moves recognized what they thought was the reappearance of Mr. Bumble, but with a much more acceptable behavior pattern. So he really was admonished to some extent. Now, this is the famous New Yorker cartoon about nobody knows your dog. In fact, things move so fast on the internet that this is no longer really applicable, because you can get a picture of the cat at the White House on the internet now, and many people are putting their pictures on their home pages, so it's no longer completely accurate that you can they don't know you're a dog. But an often discussed issue is anonymity, and there are numerous situations where anonymity seems entirely appropriate and even desirable. Psychologists, and I may have them in the opposite order, but anyway, we'll see both of them. Psychologists and sociologists point out that people benefit from being able to assume a different persona and try out different lifestyles, and this is entirely harmless if it doesn't affect the welfare of others. Almost everyone seems to like a costume party or a mass ball, and the media often cite a prominent source as the source of information. Sometimes we see lots of aliases used by women writers in former years because they were afraid their work would not be published if their gender were known. Now, usually in these cases, the publisher or the journalist does know the identity of the person, so there's someone vouching for the integrity of that source. And in most cases on bulletin boards that operate with pseudonyms or aliases, the system's operator usually has on record the real identity. But there are a number of people that are making a serious effort to provide an opportunity to send anonymous messages. And when you have a completely anonymous message, and as you know, this has been argued vociferously on both sides on the internet as to whether or not anonymous emailers should be permitted or prohibited, and some domains, some nodes do exclude messages from certain sources, largely in Finland, I believe. Now, there are cases where actual retaliation or harm may ensue if the source of the writing is known, as in the case of whistleblowers or political dissidents under authoritarian regimes. So there are some good reasons for prohibiting anonymity, and there are some good reasons for providing it. Now, we have a mixed legal system in the sense that we do not permit anonymous contributions to political parties or political candidates. We require anyone over $100 to be identified. So I think that True anonymity, which would mean that no one could trace the source of the message, really presents a terrible problem for law enforcement officials and lawyers seeking to file civil suits when they can't identify an individual to be held responsible. And I think it also creates a problem with respect to whether or not we hold the provider of the service accountable, because if we can't find an individual to hold accountable, we are likely to turn to the provider of the service, which, as we discussed before, puts serious inhibitions, I think, on their ability to operate. In the true anonymity situation, there is no defendant. You know, we don't permit drivers on real highways without a motor vehicle license, so logically we should be able to require that users of networks be responsible and be identifiable. And there may be some First Amendment impediments to such a determination, but I think they can probably be overcome, except for probably some very specific exceptions. Now, the next area I'd like to talk about is privacy. Now, I guess that makes sense. The good news about privacy is that 84% of us are very concerned about our privacy, and the bad news is that we don't really know what we mean. Some of us mean sanctity. This is what I call sanctity. This is the man who's taking a nice walk through the forest, trying to have some peace and quiet, and says, "Mr. Hoffman, your office has been trying to reach you, sir," as the tree branch comes out with the telephone. There's an even better one of the Japanese who is climbing up at the top of some peak as he is about to fall off his cellular phone, and he said, "Miss Sue, I told you not to call me," as he is about to fall off the mountainside. Now, I'd like to see us separate out what we really mean, because I say some of us think we're talking about sanctity of private spaces, and that is preventing intrusive messages like telemarketing or direct mail from coming into the space we'd like to control. Some of us mean secrecy or preventing the release of information about the skeletons in our closets, or about our medical conditions or social ills or sexual preferences. But others really are concerned with confidentiality, which is different. This is the ability to transfer information with the expectation that the person to whom we transfer the information will not disclose it to others without our knowledge and consent. What really disturbs most people is what we call transaction-generated data. And that's information which is captured from the purchase of merchandise or an airline ticket or a telephone call. And such data can easily be correlated in order to produce a reasonably accurate information profile of the individual. Furthermore, there seems to be very little legal control over the redistribution of this information far and wide to users with whom we have no prior connection. If you remember, when the Lotus Development Corporation announced a new product, a CD-ROM entitled Lotus Marketplace, containing 120 million names, addresses, and credit data, the protest was so effective that Lotus scrapped the product. Now this again, the public opposition was largely generated through online computer networks. Some 30,000 letters were sent to Lotus within a very short time, and Lotus has decided it didn't want, this wasn't the fight they wanted to get involved with us. However, many of us who are subscribers to CompuServe didn't realize when America Online got in trouble because they announced that they were going to sell lists of their subscribers, and the America Online subscribers got upset. Those of us who were CompuServe subscribers didn't realize that our names have been sold for years. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major inadequacies of the system of intellectual property rights is that facts really are not protected, and what we seek today is protection of facts about ourselves and some autonomy or control or choice of when information is to be released and to whom. Now, there is an economist at NYU who has developed a system of looking at information as a commodity and suggesting a market model for personal information that really looks very remarkably attractive to many of us who are overwhelmed with too much mail, too many phone calls, and too much intrusion upon our peace and quiet. This is what one speaker at a conference recently called the specter invading our inner sanctum. If we apply the concept of property to personal information, it doesn't necessarily mean that each of us would be entitled to payment for the use of our names and addresses. But one of my legal colleagues has in fact suggested just that every time someone uses our name or address, that some amount of money should be deposited into our social security accounts. There are other mechanisms such as barter, which are often used by professional groups, where early results from research are exchanged on a quid pro quo basis. And if you don't contribute to the group, then you're just not invited to the next conference, or you're sort of excluded from the intergroup discussing this. So I think a legal strategy for dealing with private information is necessary if we're going to really develop the information superhighway in a way in which we'd like to be able to use it. We do have 3 laws that are on the books now. We've done this on a very piecemeal basis. We have credit record laws that protect our credit records. We have a protection against the release of information about our video records. If you remember, this came into effect when Judge Bork was nominated to the Supreme Court, and the enterprising young reporter discovered his rental records at the local video store. As it turned out, he hadn't really watched any very salacious movies. He watched John Wayne movies and things that were all sort of family oriented. But the congressmen all became so upset about the possibility of being disclosed that they passed a law very quickly prohibiting this. The cable television legislation also prohibits the release of information about viewing habits. This summer, Congress also took one more step, which I think is an interesting one, although it may not have a lot of teeth in it, in requiring states to enact laws providing an opportunity to opt out of motor vehicle records. As you may know, the motor vehicle records are sold. And a lot of the states think they're gaining a fair amount of income from it, so they're not very happy to give up this right. And as I understand from David Flaherty, who is a privacy expert, there's so many exceptions to this law that almost anybody who wants to get their motor vehicle probably can get it under one exception or another. However, I think it's quite clear that it is a step in the right direction. And the polls now show that 51% of us are really very concerned about our privacy. So I think this is an area in which we're going to see more legal activity in terms of trying to sort out how we gain more control over information that is available and easily picked up on such electronic networks. Now, the last issue, which I want to discuss very briefly, is what I call governance of the system. This is just a list of the sort of overlapping ways in which we have different areas that we've talked about are covered either by local law, state law, federal law, by contract law, or by common law, tort. So the question becomes, can we have something called cyber jurisdiction, and is there an area of which may develop as cyber law? We have on the internet a bunch of what I call budding cyber lawyers. The discussion was originally called the cyber law until a lawyer out in the Midwest someplace claimed that he had trademarked use of the word cyber law. So it's now called Siberia. And I have so much trouble with all these various systems and their incompatibilities that my husband said that I should call my next book Banished to Siberia. But I think that the pioneers on the internet, of whom there are many, and you among them, I don't really welcome the influx of lawyers that are putting up their home pages, and many of them have not had much experience using the internet and these systems. And I think, but on the other hand, there are a lot of entrepreneurial lawyers looking for work who will file suits when they find something in which they think the existing law can apply. You know, I think if we look carefully at, and you're more familiar with this than I, since I don't claim to be able to surf the internet very comfortably, I do make an effort from time to time, but I think we find that we have developed within the network system itself many sanctions which can be effectively applied. Discovered flame wars and bozo filters and special purpose Usenet files for posting derisive messages. And if worse comes to worse, there's a migration to other electronic spaces. The abusers misuse the system and people go off and set up, they know that they sort of work around it. So I think whether what's happening now on the internet really constitutes cyber chaos, I rather doubt, since I think human beings really appear to desire to bring some order in their lives, and they want certain expectations of what their behavior should be. And even those who spend the better part of their waking hours in cyberspace. Not all, but I think perhaps the majority. But I think a serious question must be asked whether a special law of cyberspace is desirable, whether it's doable, and if so, who shall promulgate it, who shall legislate, and who shall attend the Constitutional Convention. Now, in case you don't know, there's already at least a Declaration of Independence for cyberspace, which is in a book called Global Networks, published last year by MIT. And there are a number of efforts going forward now. But I think there's no agreement yet whether or not there are reasons why there should be new rules for cyberspace, except, as I previously mentioned, some of the presumptions that have arisen in the use of electronic communication do run counter to the notions that are prevalent in the outside world. And they are perhaps better suited to the new technology and provide an opportunity for innovation also in the law. Clearly, no methodology has yet been devised to satisfy the current inhabitants or the new users that their respective interests are being accommodated. I was really quite impressed with the comment that Amy Bruckman made. She's a PhD student writing her thesis on electronic communication at MIT. And she made a presentation on the agonies of the Lambda Moo and trying to decide how to handle the fate of Mr. Bumble. She said she didn't really have the time to spend on the Lambda Moo that many of the other participants had to discuss what they should do about him. But on the other hand, she wasn't willing to waive her rights to participate in the decision to those who did have the time. So I think we really have to address the question of how we preserve representative government if it's needed. And it's questionable whether or not real electronic democracy in which everyone participates is workable in groups larger than some given size. Certainly the question that David Hughes keeps touting from the old Colorado City, that he wants to see all 5 billion inhabitants of the earth online, I think it's questionable whether we can deal with a democracy of that kind. But clearly we do have to determine how we're going to deal if this is going to become an electronic agora and a place in which we make real decisions about how we live. Now, in conclusion, my summary of things that I see making sense to me is first that information is not really free. Some of it is intended to be purely private and protectable, and many of us would like to keep it that way. Copyright for computer-mediated communication, however, I think is an oxymoron because everything you do with the computer is copying. So we need some separate method of handling proprietary rights, and I think it's better to look upon uses and what uses are actually made. What we call email is not really mail. It's a rich communications environment involving many different types of information transport, ranging from purely social to economically profitable entrepreneurial activities to public politics. And still, cyberspace is not another planet. Some of the laws of the real world will apply, whether the cybernauts like it or not. And the new electronic environment does offer possibilities not yet dreamed of, especially the opportunity for accessibility of many posters of messages to many other receivers of messages all over the globe. It's not the global village that McLuhan envisioned for the televised world. It is a far richer mosaic of global villages in which we as inhabitants may reside in more than one. Now, I think what is really valuable is that which is used, and a paradigm for our legal system based upon uses and abuses, upon private and public uses, commercial uses, uncompensated fair uses, rather than copies and infringement, seems a much more sensible way to handle the legal protocols. Public and private domains of information can and do coexist, and each will be enriched by access to the other. Now, whether or not I will see the riches of the global Infobahn realized in my lifetime, I rather doubt. Some of us of a certain generation may even look with apprehension, fearing that our very private spaces are being invaded. Oh, this is the Japanese one with Miss Sue. We really may prefer to opt out of the information revolution into our hideaways and what remains of the wilderness. And this one you probably can't read is that here we are snowbound and can't get into the internet. Isn't it great? Or isn't it wonderful? And I have a place in Telluride where I've been hiding out in a snowstorm, but I did still have access to the Colorado Supernet. I'm still an optimist and have great trust that many of you will live to see the dreams of the pioneers realized. And I would like to recruit more computer scientists to work with lawyers to try to devise better methods of governing electronic networks and the current process of computation which is arising in our courts. I'm encouraged that the director of the computer science department at Yale has chosen to write an article for a legal journal, Geometrics, in which he proposed contractual alternatives within cyberspace to establish agreed-upon protocols for handling unauthorized access. And I think it's a model that may provide an alternative to a long and litigious future for Siberians. The Netiquette that we find on the internet and the customary practices and protocols that have arisen among the users of these various new electronic environments offers a fertile ground for development of what I call customary law. And where customary law prevails, statutes are unnecessary. There are many efforts afoot today to determine what should become the rules of the road on the global Infobahn. They range from the Declaration of Independence, which I mentioned, to a constitutional convention for cyberspace, a Bill of Rights for the information age, a Magna Carta for the knowledge economy, and Newt Gingrich's recent release, Cyberspace and the American Dream. Now, I myself think that governance on global networks is more likely to be derived from consensual recognition that the system, whatever it is called, will only function if appropriate behavior, however we define it, becomes the norm rather than an aberration. And as Joseph Dimmitt has noted, if we want the technology to liberate rather than destroy us, then we, the techno-peasants, have to assume responsibility for it. Now, it isn't often that we have a chance to rethink basic principles on which we wish to build our societies. And I think the marriage of computers and satellites in producing cyberspace has given us that opportunity. So I would admonish you not to retire into the virtual reality of our separate cyberspaces and not waste the chance to realize the dreams of those who develop these new tools. Because dreams can become a reality if we believe that we can bend the technology to our collective will and make the real world a better place in which to live. Thank you. If you have a few questions, I'll be glad to take them. If anybody wants to escape, you may. I'm delighted. Thank you for all coming on this in the middle of the flood. I'm impressed with the audience that's turned out, so I can applaud you for getting here.
We're trapped.
I do want to correct one thing that Lynn Conrock said about my background, because she said that it was World War II that influenced my childhood. He's too young to remember that those of us that were brought up in the South in the 30s and 40s were, our childhood was molded by what we called the war, which was the Civil War. I lived in the old governor's mansion, which was a huge 20-mile. My father was president of the Women's College, and that was the official residence of the president. It's the 21-room, magnificent house, wonderful place to be brought up in genteel poverty, with a ballroom and large reception halls. And it was really quite a delightful place to be brought up. But I spent a lot of time wearing hook skirts to reenact those the great days of the South before the Civil War. Who have a question?
One of the hot topics that you didn't comment on, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on, is encryption technology.
Well,
Repeat the question.
Yeah, he's asking about encryption technology, which I did not discuss. I don't discuss it because I don't consider, in spite of the starting my career with encryption technology, I think there's so many other people who are better qualified to discuss it than I. I mean, I think many of you are probably in this room much better acquainted with what's happened with the wiretap law that went into effect in August, and also the arguments about the Clipper chip. I think my own feeling is that, and I've been looking at the questions of digicash and electronic cash, which does give an opportunity to purchase things with anonymity, just as you use dollars to buy real things. I think there's so many people who are going to use encryption one way or another that it may be very difficult from a legal standpoint to control it. I find it a very interesting argument, and I don't think the public really understands it. In fact, it took me a long time to sort out the difference between the wiretap law and the Clipper chip because I kept getting mixed up in my own room. So I think those of you who do understand it, to the extent that you can explain to the public what's at stake, it's very important to do so. I gather it's illegal actually to use the pretty good privacy, but it's very widely used, and laws don't work if people ignore them. So I think what we really haven't decided what is acceptable use and what isn't, and I'm not going to come down on either side of that because I think it's a very complex question.
All right, that remark you just made kind of is what I'm wondering about. You said it's occurred to me as an issue of relevance. I mean, you're describing to us how lawyers and judges and authors are writing all these articles and making all these opinions about how people and individual persons what they should, what they can, what they can't, what's right, what's wrong, and about their use of the internet and email and electronic communications and all that. If lawyers and government makes laws that I as a user find inconvenient or wrong or just piss me off, I'm not going to. And if in breaking those legal opinions, I feel that I don't hurt anyone. I think many people who use this equipment.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is that if you want to protect the environment that you have on the internet, and there are certain sanctions that work or do not work, then the users are going to have to come forward and establish these as their appropriate behavior in this environment. To the extent that you overlap, if you do cause harm outside that environment, and some lawyer is willing to take the case, they're going to sue you. Or they're going to put you in jail if the law says what you're doing is illegal. So I think there's a conflict between the local jurisdiction and what is considered appropriate in the computer-mediated environment. And I think that's why I say it's very important for people who are users to come forth and say, this is what makes sense, and this is what we've been doing, and this is what the standard of care is in this environment. You're finding the whole electronic environment being invaded by a lot of people who see it as a commercial opportunity. So there's a clash of cultures there, and how it's to be accommodated, we have to wait and see. Unfortunately, I think the judicial system really is not prepared to cope with a lot of this.
Yeah, just one more thing, and interesting. I think this trying to figure out the law of this thing can't exist in a vacuum without us having input. Lawyers and judges can't do it alone.
Well, they're not going to invite you to come have input if you don't assert your interests. That's why I'm saying you can't sit back. I mean, I think computer scientists, by and large, over the last couple of decades, the copyright law, they sort of ignore it and think, well, it doesn't really work, and therefore we just won't pay much attention to it. But the fact of the matter is, you want it to be changed to make something sensible out of it, then you have to come forward and say what is sensible. In fact, my husband went in National Research Council exercise on copyright law several years ago, and they were trying to get computer scientists from some of the major software companies to come, and the lawyers in those companies wouldn't let the computer scientists come to attend the meeting because they think they have control over the copyright system and it's sort of working, and they don't want anybody mucking it up. I think that's unfortunate. Because there are a lot of things that really don't make sense to me, and the more I look at it, the less sensible a lot of the things appear. And I think there are solutions if we're willing to sit down and look at it with a rational mind. Somebody over here had a question. Yes.
Why should we let politicians and lawyers have more say in our life? Why people just adopt policy that the court will not hear anything in cyberspace?
Well, I hate to say it's sort of a naive question in the sense that I think to a large extent, I'm encouraging you to do that in the sense of saying that if you want to establish something that's separate, with a separate jurisdiction, you've got to have systems that work. And there are many examples. We have bylaws of organizations. We have all sorts of things that work for particular purposes. Back in the Middle Ages, there was something called the law merchant, which just affects the people who were trading across vast distances, and they developed their own system of courts and protocols and applying rules. And I think to the extent that you have a system that works and control that electronic environment and your behavior doesn't spill over into the geographical jurisdiction, then no problem. I think people will say, well, the system seems to be working. If nobody's filing suits in court, if people don't become litigious and there's a working system, then I think that's fine. But that isn't what's happening today. What's happening today is that people are coming into courts and applying existing rules and existing legal metaphors which don't quite make sense.
But unless we establish some procedures for intellectual property rights, there's going to be whole industries that don't enter the internet, such as the publishing industry.
That's right.
They're right up against it now. We have to provide some guidance to the publishing industry.
That's right. A lot of people would just assume keep all the commercial interests off the internet. That's not realistic because they're going to use it. It's not the internet. It's going to be something more like them. The internet is no longer what it was a year ago anyway. Commercial interests are coming in, and I think the real question is how you preserve the culture that has existed alongside accommodating commercial interests. And you can't do it with generic laws that apply across the board. I think you have to look on different segments, or what I call cyberspaces, that there are different types of electronic communication and you need to differentiate between them. And the real danger is having Congress or state legislatures establish laws that apply across the board for everything on the quote internet or what have you, because we have a very rich communications environment in the real world. We have all sorts of private ways of communicating, all sorts of public ways of communicating, and we just haven't translated those yet to the electronic network.
These last few questions are pushing at what for me is a tension inside your talk. I like very much everything you said, which is if we think about cyber law, I imagine two approaches to it. One is an incrementalist approach, where we take existing copyright law and say, gee, how does that be updated for the new media? The other is to take cyberspace as another planet approach. Which says, gee, this is a domain of very different properties, and perhaps law has to be very different, allowing for that. And some of the comments from the cyberspace denizens, perhaps it's a fantasy that wants to run that way, but I think what is true is law, while it's a marvelous edifice, it does fail in places that it runs against what is kind of the on-the-ground reality of the stable, the game theoretic set of social conventions. And in this domain, certain things like intellectual property or like anonymity, there are practical limits of what may be legislated away without the use of global government with fairly authoritative kind of powers. And so in particular, it may be possible to say, gee, I really don't think that the following use of materials are fair use of it. It's good for economic growth or whatever, but it may be impossible to limit it.
Yeah, I think you can set up spaces in which you establish the rules on a contractual basis and say, when you come into this environment, you agree to abide by these rules, and this is the way we behave. You aren't going to find Islamic countries wanting to permit the downloading of pornographic GIF files into those countries. On the other hand, it will be almost impossible to prevent somebody from using a dial-up telephone, if that's permitted, to dial into a Paris or a Finland telephone number and get it. So there will always be ways that you can't control the environment, but there are many ways in which you can.
I think I'd better draw this to a close. I want to thank you very much for pointing out the enormity of these problems.